Hi, I'm Brittany Todd, a Pioneer sales rep from Grey County, Ontario. And you're listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Brittany, and thank you for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. For today's episode, we've got a great discussion lined up to look back over the last several decades and think back to just how far we've come in yield. If you stop and think about what a good crop was for your first growing season and what you expect to grow now, how big is that spread? And the question to ask our two guests is, who's responsible? Is it the researchers that have brought new traits to the market? Or is it farmers and their management? Or is it a combination? To help us answer that is Dr. Lucas Borras, a research scientist for Corteva out of the Johnston, Iowa Research Facility, as well as Dave Harwood, technical services manager in Eastern Canada for Corteva, who's based in Ontario. Lucas, Dave, thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This is an interesting subject, and I'm actually really looking forward to this discussion, guys, because I mean, even for me, and admittedly, I have a relatively short farming career to probably many that are listening. I kind of count it as, a decade of doing it. And when I look at the progress of yields in particular, especially with corn and soybeans, what I budget for in terms of potential has gone up every single year, and I'm more and more confident every year with adding those gains in. And so to have this discussion, I think is going to be a lot of fun to say, okay, who's responsible for all these gains? I'd love to say I've learned so much in 10 years, from guys like Dave, and therefore it's all my doing. But I know it probably is a combination of a lot of things. So Lucas, I'm going to start with you. In your career, not just with Corteva, but in agriculture in general, when you first started out, are we at a place that you thought we'd be in terms of yield potential in North America? Are we higher? Are we lower? Just where are we?
I thought we were going to be lower, to be honest. But yield increases have been fantastic during the last 40, 50 years. So both corn and soybean are increasing yields at about 1% per year or more. And we basically say that yield increase is a part due to genetics and a part due to better agronomy. In terms of genetics, we've gone from, in the 30s and 40s in the US, from open pollinated varieties to double hybrids, to triple hybrids, to single hybrids, and then to traits that gave us a little better, response to insects and to weeds. So yields have been increasing. Traditionally, there's a lot of studies from crop physiologists that they say that yields are starting to plateau. But the reality is that it's increasing every year. So, and I basically have a kind of a number. Every 10 years, we increase our yields by 15 to 20 bushels per acre.
That's a pretty remarkable gain, Dave, when you do think back. If you start compounding that, decade after decade. When you first started, is this where you thought we'd be, or do you kind of fall in that same boat that this is higher than even you expected?
Yeah, it is higher than I expected. And so my career in the industry started in the mid 80s. So I've been at it for 35 years or something silly. And I would say in our neck of the woods, meaning across Eastern Canada, a good corn crop would have been described as 125 bushels per acre. That's not to say we didn't have higher, but that was a reasonable target. And now, growers are targeting considerably more than that. And what the average corn crop was when I started, I don't know. It would be higher. It would be lower than 125. But but a good crop would be 125. Now, 200 bushel is kind of what most people are striving for. So it's really changed dramatically. One reference point that we have in Ontario is the Ontario Corn Committee runs trials, performance trials on behalf of producers each year that measures the relative performance of the commercial hybrids at the time. And I've gone back in some of the old reports from the 60s, and what you really notice are yield levels are much lower, more in that 100 bushel range. And this is from small plots, which tend to exaggerate yields. And the amount of stock breakage is really noticeable. You look in the report today, the percent broken stocks is single digits generally. At that time, it was double digits, often 25, 30%. And I think, the BT traits in the case of corn have really improved crop stability quite remarkably from limiting the amount of broken stalks, which were generally a function of corn borer, and but as well just making the crop healthier so it can survive later in the season. When you get tunneling in the stalks, that causes premature death, and that is eliminated with BT, and that has really allowed us to push the crop harder. So that's maybe where genetics and management come together, that you've got a more robust crop that tolerates more intensive management than pre-BT.
Yeah, also talking about, stock breakage, if you go 30, 40 years ago, when you reach physiological maturity, R6, most of the crop was already senesced. Today, right, you go at R6, and at least you have 3, 4, 5 green leaves. So the plant reaches maturity, the timing in which kernels are fully filled, in a totally different way than they used to reach before. And that's part of genetics, but there's also a part of in the agronomy, in how we manage nitrogen, how we kind of take care of the crop in terms of fertilizer management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that as we transitioned into BT, that was about middle of my career, I suppose. And just that observation of, wow, this is a green plant with brown husks, and it was like a new experience, observing those hybrids when we first deployed BT.
So then if we break these apart a little and have two discussions on this in terms of the genetics and the management side, Lucas, let's start with you on that genetic side. We talked about, stock breakage and just standability of the crop as being kind of one of those markers that really stands out as one of the big improvements made. Over the last, 40 years, what are some of the others that stand out as being, real things that made real big gains?
So, first of all, the shape of the plant has changed. So we have a plant that has more erect leaves, a plant that has a tassel that is smaller, and that smaller tassel changed the biomass, where the biomass goes. It goes more to the ear rather than to the last part of the stalk and then the tassel, basically. So those things changed. The plant today, if you go and you see at flowering, a modern genotype will have a more synchronous female and male synchrony, especially when you have a drought stress or a stress around flowering. An old genotype would delay the silk appearance compared to the antithesis or the let's say the pollen appearance. So those are things that have changed. And when I say modern genotypes have more erect leaves, that is also related to the agronomy. We are placing more plants, and these things allowed us to place more plants to push the yields further. So we can talk about the genetics, but it's always about the genetics and the agronomy together, because we are changing the genetics in a way that is adapting to the newer agronomy that we are placing in the field. I don't know, Dave, what you think, but...
Yeah, same question to you, Dave, really on that genetics. You've put a lot of plots in over your 35-year career. What have you seen? Is it the same type of stuff that you think has benefited those yield numbers on both corn and beans?
Yeah, I think we spoke about BT and the impact it's had, and I think that really is significant. Especially as we've moved north in the Corn Belt, it wouldn't be uncommon for us to see 25 bushel yield impacts of European corn borer, and most corn farmers today just don't remember that time or haven't experienced it, and so that was a huge improvement in crop stability that, as I said earlier, allows us to push the crop harder. But I work with soybeans now as well. I spent most of my career working with corn genetics, but now soybeans. And I think the trait that often maybe gets overlooked in terms of its contribution to crop performance are the herbicide traits. And when I started my career, you could tell the good farmers from the less proficient farmers by the weed control in soybeans. Weed control in soybeans was hard. And today, with the transgenic technologies, as well as just other new herbicide molecules, we do a much better job of weed control in soybeans. And so that allows producers to more routinely achieve closer to the genetic potential of their crop by eliminating significant weed pressure. But it also allows us to evaluate the crop better and, in my opinion, make better product decisions as we're evaluating new genetics, because we control weeds better even in experimental plots. So weed control in soybeans has really allowed the crop to improve, both from an agronomic point of view and producers better managing weeds in their field, but even researchers making better advancement decisions. Another thing that I think has contributed a lot to our improved crop performance are seed applied technologies on both the corn and soybean side. And, we plant corn and soybeans as early as we ever have, especially soybeans. We've moved soybeans to almost the same timing as corn. We would just never do that before. We'd always plant soybeans in the north after corn. And I think that's to a great extent because of seed applied technologies. And you get soybeans in early, and I'm wondering to what extent that might have even changed in what you described as relatively brief farming career, Andrew. But planting soybeans early results in a higher yielding crop more often than not. And I think that's not to be overlooked.
Well, and you're just not, I think for us, I'm just not afraid to plant them early anymore. At one time it was almost, if it's going to stay cool and damp, like those are just going to rot in the ground. Like you just can't do it that early. Whereas now you're absolutely right. Like if we can find two tractors on two different planters, we're going to do it, and we're going to plant them at the same time because we've seen the gains that way. So then, that kind of goes to the next conversation I have, and that's on the management side. And Dave, I'm going to start with you this time in terms of, over that, 35 years and even, longer when you start looking at, things like what the Corn Committee said, back into the 60s and earlier. What are some of those key farm management changes that have been made, maybe sometimes going along with the genetic side, but sometimes just on their own? What's helped to push these yields to, what even you weren't expecting when you first started?
Yeah, I do. I think the last topic is part of it. The seed applied technologies for corn, both on the fungicide side and seed applied insecticides, have greatly reduced the risk of early season stand loss, whether it's pathogen related or insect related. So we're driving the crop harder with more timely planting. But contributing and the folks on the mechanical side of the equation need full marks too, that the quality of our planting equipment has advanced very considerably, so that we are making much better seed soil contact, much better singulation, and therefore just better plant stands right from the get-go. And that is as many as it may be stating the obvious, but can often get forgotten just how much better we are at getting a good stand in the field. And one measure of that is the number of complaints we get, farmers reporting to us, my corn stand isn't good enough. What, you guys are at fault. We get remarkably few of those for the number of acres that our products are planted on every year. And I think it reflects that farmers have better equipment, are operating it with greater precision. So you've got the whole decision ag side of things where Lucas lives, and better seed applied technologies. All this is contributing to improvement.
I will agree. Through genetics and through management, we have reduced the plant-to-plant variability. More uniform stands give better yields, and they gave better yields specifically under the seasons that are more dry. So I always say that a uniform stand pays off in the bad years, not in the good years.
Right.
But we have reduced our plant-to-plant variability through genetics. Our newer genotypes are more plants are more uniform when you see the plant-to-plant variability, and then seed treatments, planters. We have changed that both in corn and in soybean drastically, and I can say not only in the U.S. but in South America, that has also been a yield driver during these years.
Yeah, I don't have data to support this, but I wonder to what extent we've improved the timing of planting. Just with the capacity most farms have today, are we getting the crop in a more timely way? Better equipment, scaled as is necessary to get the crop in the optimum window. I have to think we're better at that now than we used to be, but I don't have any data to support my contention. But boy, it sure looks that way to me.
Well, and so this kind of then leads to the final part of the conversation that I want to have is what's the potential now? Because I think that's really exciting for me when I think, like, if we're talking gains like we've seen, that we've talked about, then like am I crazy to think that someday I'll be budgeting 100 bushel beans and 300 bushel corn? Like that's where the graphs are going for me. It's hard to imagine, but like, Lucas, I'm curious, from the research and genetic side, like, do you think it's possible?
Oh yeah, it will. We don't know when we're going to reach that, but we will reach that. In genetic gains in corn and in soybean are a straight line. We haven't seen any plateauing in any of the crops, so we are increasing our yields in both crops. And I would say, no, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious, with that, we talked about a few of those markers that really set yields up big time in a few, whether it's BT, whether it's seed applied technologies, whether it's some of these herbicide traits. Is it going to take another one of those breakthroughs, or is it just more improvements of this?
You never know what's going to be the new technology that is going to give us a yield bump. And we all say maybe the technology is out there, but it's not massive, so we haven't seen it. But the thing is that we are increasing our yield potential, and the other important thing is that we are increasing our tolerance to stress. This is very important also. Our newer genotypes are more tolerant to drought stress. That gives us more yield stability across years. Our newer genotypes are more nitrogen use efficiency. Have more nitrogen efficiency, so they produce more yield per unit of nitrogen available, and they have the physiological basis is that they have more radiation use efficiency, so they're producing more biomass per unit of radiation intercepted from the sun. So these things, I mean, we need to consider that, especially in corn, you see it very evidently that we have been increasing our yield potential and our yield stability at the same time.
I love that you brought that up, Lucas, because I think that is a big one that I think about too, is just that consistency. And Dave, when I look at, going through harvest right now, certainly it was pretty variable here in Ontario based on, rainfall and that. So I don't want to say that, it's perfect even without rain or with inches and inches of rain on top. But that curve seems to have evened out, that even if there's a few bad weeks, if the right moisture comes at the right time, it seems to work.
Yeah. This is line of discussion reminds me of some text exchange I had with some of our agronomists just this morning. And one of them reported that, we're hearing of some, and the term he used was blowouts on heavy clay ground for corn, and meaning poor results. And that meant 100 bushels per acre on these heavy clays that got very little rain. We had remarkably dry summer, one of the driest in recent memory. And as I mentioned quite some time ago, the average yield in the Ontario Corn Report in the 1960s was probably 100 bushels per acre. So what's described now as a blowout, a disaster, it was the average, 40 or in the 60s. So we've come a long way in stability if a 100 bushel crop is a blowout.
So then in terms of some of those, farm management practices, or maybe it's more on the equipment supply, the equipment side of things, but, if I'm going to get to 300 bushel corn average and, expect 100 bushel beans, where do you think some of those gains come from, Dave, in terms of, me managing those acres better?
This might be kind of a bit of a boring answer, but I think it will be more of the same, meaning bringing more timely and effective crop protectants to the table to manage disease and other stressors to the crop. And just so that we can continue to push this crop harder, so that we can more reliably keep it healthy to the normal timing of physiological maturity. So I think that's a key element. So we haven't really spoken yet about just what fungicides have brought to corn and soybean production. And when I started my career, you didn't put fungicides on either crop. It just wasn't done, So, I think we'll continue to identify those ways we can support the health of the crop, even beyond genetics.
So to give some perspective to that, fungicides use are increasing in the U.S. every year in corn, right. And it's about 1% per year, 1.5% per year. The acreage that is gaining fungicide use is gaining every year. So that's basically a lot. I mean, we are increasing the use of fungicides to protect that yield that Dave was saying. The other thing is that we are also applying more nitrogen. In Iowa, we are adding 1 pound per acre per year. So that also adds to your yield potential as you're placing more fertilizers. The other thing that is important is that we see tile drainage is increasing. So there's more tile in our farms. So the quality of our land is becoming better and better. So that we place the newer genetics in better managed soils in terms of nitrogen, in terms of water, and then in terms of what protects the yield, in terms of traits to reduce insect pressure or fungicides for reducing disease pressure.
Yeah, I've observed, as I'm sure you have, Andrew, the amount of tile that's gone in Eastern Canada in the last 5 years, I would say it's just off the chart. And I've observed that, just driving rural routes. And what the first thought that comes to mind for me is, as farmers have improved productivity and benefit and reap the financial rewards of improving productivity and revenue from acreage, they're just plowing a lot of that money back into those acres to make them even more productive. There's sometimes an expression, a common mentality of farmers: if a little is good, then a lot is better. And I think that's the way that's their experience with drainage, that you can't have too much of it.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that, because I think it goes for so many things. Maybe it's drainage, but then the next year it could be that upgrade to the planter that's going to be even better, or a bigger machine that can cover more acres, or like, we don't sit on cash, people. This is what we do: is we spend it to make sure that we can do better the next time. That's what I feel anyway.
Yeah.
But that's basically why yield gains are 50% genetics and 50% agronomy. There's more better planters, better timing, as Dave said, more nitrogen use, more fungicide use, and then at the same time we are developing new genotypes with higher yield potential and more stability. The two things are going at the same time.
Then is there any, if we look at what the potential is and how far can we go, is there any risks that maybe, kind of shoot us in the foot, that maybe slow us down in some of these gains? Like, is there anything that you see in the future that says, whoa, we've got to really watch this, or else those yield numbers are actually at risk? Dave, you're nodding your head. What do you think?
Well, I think what comes to mind is a topic that's been, the subject of much chatter as I've been at farm meetings over the last 6 months, and that are the aspirations of our federal government to reduce emissions from agriculture, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And so you probably haven't heard this, Lucas, but there's a goal thrown out there of reducing emissions by 30%, I believe is the number. And nitrous oxide's a big part of that equation. And so the extent to which we can maintain fertility rates under that kind of an initiative creates anxiety for me and producers in general, I think. So I think that's a challenge. Can we maintain productivity as measured by, the amount of crop produced per unit area under what may be lower fertility regimes? But perhaps, the way what often happens in a scenario like that is we get more creative about the way we apply nutrients, the way we protect nutrients from either leaching or creating emissions. And so I'm hopeful that will be what transpires here, that should we have those kind of limits placed on us, that we'll find ways to achieve those reductions with reductions in emissions while maintaining productivity.
Yeah, we don't have to forget that our newer genotypes are more sustainable than our older genotypes in terms of, for the same amount of inputs, we are producing more yield. So it's a question of producing more tons per unit of inputs that we are placing in the field. So we are in our newer genotypes are more water use efficient. So in irrigation land, we are producing more yield per unit of water applied. So we need to always kind of remind us that our newer genetics are more sustainable than our older genetics.
Well, I think it's a great subject to end our episode off today, guys, because certainly the excitement is there, and I think the potential is there to see some big gains. And it's just been a fun conversation to have with you guys to see how we've gotten to where we are and what we're going to be heading into in the future. So, Lucas, Dave, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Next time on the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast, we do something we've never done before by heading to Western Canada. As a grower, it's always interesting to hear from others about their crops, their conditions, and their challenges, which is why we're going to talk about all of that with our guests from Saskatchewan. That's next time. On behalf of myself and the entire team working behind the scenes, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget, you can always get in touch on Twitter at Pioneer Seeds CA or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And for more information or advice, talk to your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.